Good morning, good afternoon, or good night, and welcome to Command Power, the show in which we discuss all things Magic the Gathering with a focus on Commander. And today we have a brand new deck for you, and just as a quick heads up, this is not a budget deck, although I do think it should be fairly easy to find substitutes for those expensive cards. But before we do that, just a quick reminder to please click subscribe if you enjoy my videos. I'm currently growing the channel and I'm getting very close to 1,000 subscribers, so it would mean the world to me if you could support me. And today we have a brand new deck for you. To celebrate its unbanning, we are going to make a Golos Tireless Pilgrim deck. Now, I was quite surprised to hear that this was unbanned, but I've always liked this commander, and now it's finally the time, I think, to build a deck around him. And if you don't know what he does, for 5 colors, he's a legendary artifact creature scout with 3/5, and when he enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a land card, put that card onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library, and for 2 and Wooburg, you can exile the top 3 cards of your library. You may play them this turn without paying their mana costs. So because Golos doesn't really have a very specific way to build around him, I've kind of decided to build a deck with cards that I really enjoy, and I've been putting them in like different packages of cards that work well together, so we'll be discussing those separately. Instead of doing the normal go through every creature and etc, we're just going to discuss cards in groups. So starting out, we have Blighted Agent, which is in the deck along with Invisible Stalker because of its synergy with Brokos, Apex of Forever. This is really sweet because with these two in the deck, Brokos is going to be incredibly hard to remove and have Infect, and then if they do remove it, you can still cast it again and again from your graveyard onto these 2 creatures, which is incredible value, to be honest, and it's very difficult to deal with late game. Next up, we have Chainer Nightmare Adept. That is in the deck because it gives us some really good late game staying power by working really well as well with Flayer of the Hatebound. It's going to deal so much damage when we play our creatures from our graveyard with Chainer, and it's going to allow us to keep removing our opponent's stuff and keep playing things from the graveyard, which is great. Next up, we have Daryl, Hunter of Walkers. I really like this card, and I've liked it for a while because it gives you some really nice card advantage with those zombies dying. And we're going to be playing it together with the card Compost, which is super good because every time one of our zombies die, we're going to draw an extra card. We're basically drawing 2 cards because a black card is being put into the graveyard. When you add Grismold to the mix as well, that's going to give us even more card draws, as this is giving our opponents tokens that are then going to die and draw us cards. Very, very sweet. We've got Obeka in this deck, and Obeka is going to work really well with effects that last until end of turns. So we have Decimator of the Provinces to give our creatures a permanent +2/+2 and trample until the end of the game, thanks to Obeka. We have Molten Primordial, which is going to allow us to steal our opponent's stuff and keep it forever. We have Veto Thorn of the Dusk Rose, which is super good because it's going to give our creatures lifelink permanently. That's going to make it really hard for our opponents to race. Flawless Maneuver is also going to work really well by giving our creatures permanent indestructible, and seeing as we can play it for free if we have our commander out, that's just extra gravy on top. So all of these cards work really well with Obeka, so that's why they're in the deck. Next up, we have Drivnod Carnage Dominus. Now this one is an interesting one because it only works with a couple of cards in the deck, but the ones it works with are really good. It's going to work super well with Negan because Negan, of course, is making our opponents sacrifice creatures, and then we're going to get a treasure whenever those creatures are sacrificed. Drivnod is going to double those triggers. Teysa Karlov is also in the deck for the same reason. It's going to double these triggers from Negan, and it's just going to get us so many treasures, which is going to help with casting our other cards. Felden of the Third Path is going to work really, really well with Humble Defector because it's going to create multiple Humble Defectors that we can then tap to draw 2 cards and give to our opponents, but they're going to have to sacrifice them, so they're not going to get to use it. Felden also works pretty well with a few of the other cards in the deck, so it's a nice include here. Generous Patron is a card that I've always really liked. I like that I get resources out of gifting my opponents other things, and it's going to work really well with a few cards in the deck. We actually have a decent package here. We have Glunch because it's going to be putting counters on our opponent's creatures, which is great. Noble Heritage basically does the same thing. We're going to put counters on our opponent's creatures, which is going to make us draw cards. And Orzhov Advocist is doing the same thing as well, putting counters on our opponent's creatures, which all draw us cards. Very, very solid in this deck. Next up, we have Gerson Starn Kellamorph, and this is a really great one that I've loved since it was spoiled. It's going to work really, really well with Chandra Awakened Inferno by giving our opponents an emblem that is going to deal 1 damage to them, which then becomes 3 damage thanks to Gerson Starn. For the same reason, we also have Obsidian Fireheart in the deck. That is going to make each land that we put a counter on deal 3 damage to our opponents instead of 1, which is obviously awesome. Next up, we have Kira, Great Glass Spinner, which is a pretty decent one in this deck anyway, since we have a lot of very fragile creatures. One of those very fragile creatures is Zada. We have a few cards that target creatures, so Zada is great, and it's nice to have Kira in the deck so that Zada can't be removed as easily. Next up we have Marath, Will of the Wild, which is going to work really well with Impact Tremors. Since it goes infinite with that card, we just win the game on the spot. You can pay X and remove X counters from Marath to make an XX creature, so we can pay 0, remove 0 counters, and make a 0/0, which immediately is going to die, which works really well with Impact Tremors. It's also going to work really well with Drivnod and Taser Cardloff, which we talked about before. Marauding Raptor is going to be pretty good with a lot of cards in the deck, but we have it here for 2 reasons basically. One, it has a really good interaction with Nightmare Shepherd, that's really nice, but then of course we have Polyraptor, which is going to basically allow us to make infinite dinosaurs. We can just keep going until we have as many dinosaurs as we want with these 2 cards in play, which is fantastic. Next up we have Morog, Fury of Akum. This is a really good one because we are actually playing quite a lot of fetch lands, as you'll see later when we talk about the mana base, so this is going to allow us to trigger this multiple times a turn, hopefully. But then just in case that's not enough, we have Soul of Windgrace in here, and Soul of Windgrace basically goes infinite with Morog, Fury of Akum, because when it attacks, we return a land onto the battlefield. If we have any sort of fetch land, which we should, then we can sacrifice it immediately and return it again during the next combat phase, and so on and so forth. We get infinite attack phases. Very solid. Mossbridge Troll is just a card that I've always really liked. It's absolutely huge and really strong, and having that clause that stops it from being destroyed is really fantastic. We can play it alongside a bunch of Wrath effects. We have Wrath of God, Rout, and Damnation. Those are all going to work really well because our troll is going to survive and everything else is going to die. And to add to this kind of strategy, we've also included a few ways to protect our other creatures from our Wrath effects, such as Golgari Charm and Rapid Vigor, which should keep our board super safe. Next up, we have Phyrexian Obliterator. This is a card I've always liked. It's a little bit hard to cast, but we're getting a lot out of it. So we have a bunch of cards that are going to work well with Phyrexian Obliterator. We have Inviolability, which is going to prevent all damage dealt to it. That means it can attack with impunity and we don't need to be scared about it dying. And if our opponents block, they're going to be sacrificing a bunch of stuff. Then we have a couple of other cards that don't work so well with Inviolability, but work very well with Phyrexian Obliterator, which are Sorrow's Path, which allows us to mess with our opponents and deal 2 damage to the Obliterator, which is going to make them sacrifice stuff. And then Embrose, which is also going to deal 2 damage to a creature, which of course with Phyrexian Obliterator means that they're going to have to sacrifice permanents. Just some nice little synergy and combos going on there. Next up, we're trying to get some value with a card like Snapcaster Mage. Snapcaster Mage is obviously really good with all the instants and sorceries that we have in this deck, but it works really well particularly with Ephemerate. So if you don't know how that interaction works, basically you're going to be able to cast Ephemerate from your graveyard with the flashback from Snapcaster Mage, and then the rebound ability is going to exile it, and then you're going to cast it again from exile, at which point it's going to go back to your graveyard. You can target the Snapcaster Mage again and repeat the loop basically forever. And each time you're getting to blink one of your creatures, which is very solid. It's a bit slow and grindy, but it's a great way to gain advantage in the late game. Now we're moving on to some of our ramp cards. We have a few of them. We have Explosive Vegetation, Farseek, and Rampant Growth. Those are all going to work really well with our land base, and they're also going to work really well with Horn of Greed. So Horn of Greed is going to draw us a card every time a land comes into play under our control. So these are all going to draw us a ton of cards, especially as well with all the fetch lands we've got in the deck. This is just fantastic. Next up, we've got a card that doesn't really have that much synergy with anything in the deck, but it's just a really solid card, which is Gifts Ungiven. I really like this, and I'm surprised that it's not in more commander decks, honestly. Finally, we have Blood Moon as a hedge against very multicolored decks. Since we have so many fetch lands, this actually doesn't hurt us that much, but it's really going to punish some of our opponents, so we have this in there just to make sure we make them pay. And finally, here is our land base. I realize we're going through it very quickly, but if you want to see more details on it, you can click on the link to the deck list in the description below and take your time seeing this beautifully crafted land base. So anyway, there you have it. That has been our Golos Tireless Pilgrim deck. Well done if you got this far, and happy April Fools, everyone. I hope you don't hate me. What do you think? Are there any things you would change? Any additions that you think I missed? Please let me know in the comments section below. I read all comments and respond to all of them too. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click like or subscribe. It really helps the channel. And until next time, take care.